Hello, and welcome to the R Retro Gaming Podcast. My name is Rob, and I'll be your host today. I'm the moderator of R Retro Gaming on Reddit, and joining me as co host today are Spooky Cookies, also known as Daniel, and Awesomus Prime, also called Andrew. Joining us on the show today is none other than Jeremy Blaustein, who worked for Konami during the 90s, where he localized and translated a lot of the games that we loved as kids and grew up with, like Castlevania and Metal Gear and Snatcher, which he's even responsible for bringing to the US and getting it translated on Sega CD. Jeremy himself is a real character. This is called Uncensored for a reason, folks. So know that there's going to be some foul language, and know that Jeremy is more of a character as an individual than a lot of the characters that he wrote for. So stick around for some great behind the scenes stories about Konami, Jaleco, and Jeremy's views on the gaming industry.
All right, so Jeremy, why don't we start at the beginning? So, if I'm right about the information I have, you studied Asian studies at university, and then
Yeah.
what made you interested in Asian culture in the first place?
Well, I was interested in it along with other things. Actually, I was more into originally, I guess I'd have to say I was more into like the Lord of the Rings Viking thing, you know, like
Yeah,
Celtic Viking stuff. And when I got into college, I was like, I was like, wow, college sure offers a lot of more interesting things than high school, and look at all these cool classes I can take. And there was a class in Norse and Celtic literature that I took, and I was still pretty geeked out on Lord of the Rings and all that stuff. So and I had in my mind, I didn't know what I wanted to do at all, but I felt like I was a pretty boring person, and I thought, if I study, I thought there was a sort of a proportional relationship between the strangeness of paths that I took and how interesting I would be as a person. And so, and I didn't really want to study anything too conventional. I wanted to come away with some kind of, concrete skill. And so, actually, I was going to study Welsh. Was my first choice. Yeah, yeah. The teacher of Welsh was this woman who taught the Norse and Celtic literature class. We read stuff like the Mabinogion. I don't even know how to pronounce it, because Welsh pronunciation is fucking hard.
Oh, I know.
It's crazy,
I can vouch
Um,
for that.
yeah, and so I was going to study Welsh with her, and she actually said to me, you know, really? What are you going to do with Welsh? There's nothing you can do. I strongly recommend you don't study Welsh. This is a Welsh teacher. So, so I went back to the course catalog and started thinking, well, what else do I like, and the choices were like, Russian and Chinese and Japanese, and I chose Japanese because the other thing I was kind of influenced by was, looking back now, I realized it was things like going to see The Seven Samurai with my dad at the time.
Great movie.
Shogun was a TV series that was on TV for a long time, for a while. That influenced me, and I had the sense that, and it turned out to be the correct sense, actually, amazingly, that Japan was a country that somehow the people had their shit together. I had a pretty chaotic life. My family was kind of chaotic, and it didn't seem like there was a clear rules, or for how people should behave, or that kind of thing. And I had the sense that the Japanese would have more like clearly delineated ideas about how people should be, how they should live and what rules they should follow. And for some reason I was drawn to that.
yeah.
um
And you live there now.
yeah, yeah.
How long have
And
you
I
lived in
followed
Japan?
I've lived here Well, let's see. I'd have to like add together the years.
So not
Probably
consecutive.
been. Yeah, it's not
You-
consecutive.
back and forth.
Yeah, I came over as an exchange student, and then I went back, and then I came back for a few months, and I went back, and then I came over for about 3 years, and I went back to America for 15 years, and I've been back here now for about 6 years. So probably 10 or 11 years, 11, 12 years. Yeah.
Over the past couple decades.
Over the past 30 years, yeah.
Cool. So how did you first get into the game world?
I first got into the game world when I was in Chicago, the Chicago area, and let's see, how did that even develop? I guess I got a job with this company, Jaleco.
Yeah.
Japan Leisure Company, which is now defunct. And this was their American office. I only worked there for like 3 months before I was fired. Yeah, I was fired.
For what?
I was fired basically for insubordination, I had to make a long story short, what we did there was it was the 16-bit days, right?
Right.
And the relationship between Japanese, the video game world was very different then. Okay, and how was it different? Well, basically it was it was Japan ran everything, and American games were a joke, and the Japanese R&D team, in Japan, were making games. They would make the games they wanted to make, and there were games for their own domestic audience. And America and the West was just an afterthought. It was like every year we would get a list of what games they had made or were going to make. Maybe they would, allow us to express our hopes. Could you please make this kind of game? And they would say, I'll think about it. But mostly what they said was, we've got a baseball game, we've got this game, we've got this game. And what are you interested in? What do you think you might be able to sell in the U.S. market? And we would list those, and then they would give their R&D team a certain amount of time to make a certain amount of small changes to fit the U.S. audience. An example would be there was a game called in English we called it Wampum. This is a funny story because this was
oh man, that's one of my favorite underrated NES games.
Well, the story behind that, what Wampum was. It was like monkey fucking Monkey King or some. It's based on this Chinese epic.
Oh, the journey of the
right. That's
West. Is that what it is?
Yeah. You got it. You got it. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff is based on that.
Yeah, but
the Monkey King and the priest and all that, they go over to the temple.
Yeah, but
Okay.
people like you didn't exist 30 years ago. Things like that. The internet didn't exist, and it was just a weird fucking monkey with a crown running around or whatever, and it didn't make any sense at all. I didn't know what it was. So we came up with stupid ideas like it became Wampum. Really, I love that. I love the story. It became Wampum. It was actually, I'm pretty sure it was the idea of Howie Rubenstein, who interestingly enough was the music guy, the sound music guy on shit, what was it? Qbert.
Yeah,
he was the
Cuba.
guy who did
Okay.
the music for Qbert. So he was the American president of Jaleco, and he came up with this idea: we'll make this little monkey creature into an Indian. We'll make his his crown into a feather headdress, and his weird little staff thing into a tomahawk. And wampum, of course, is a pun.
Right.
Wampum.
Nothing more American than tomahawks and headdresses.
Yeah, and sort of American and Indian stereotypes,
Right.
We'll give the children something they can understand.
Yeah. So anyway, so how did I get fired? I got fired because I had a couple years, maybe 3 years of Japanese studies under my belt, and I was asked to communicate with Japan on one of these request things. We had a game called Bases Loaded.
Mm-hmm.
It was a baseball series, and my Japanese boss asked me to translate this list of requests to send to Japan. Translate it to Japanese, mind you, which even now, if you ask me to translate into proper business Japanese, it's not going to be pretty. I mean, I can do a pretty good job now, but business Japanese, written business Japanese is very different than spoken Japanese, and I didn't even speak Japanese that well then. Now looking back, so anyway, so I after over like 2 or 3 days, I painstakingly composed what I think is a letter to Japan, an email to Japan, probably a fax at the time, and I give it to my boss, Japanese guy, and he looks it over and he says, "This isn't even Japanese. What is this? Doesn't like make any sense." And I was so furious because I'd spent so much time doing it, and my ego was all involved in it.
Yeah.
And I let my temper show, and that was the first lesson about Japanese companies, is that you don't lose your shit.
Good advice for most situations.
Yeah. So he fired me on the spot.
What happened?
I was like, "Why didn't you help me with this?" So I had brought my twin brother in.
Okay.
I've got a twin brother, Michael Blaustein, and I brought him into Jaleco. We were both, huge game fans. All we did was play games. So he came in. We were both there. He stayed. I left. But this was a good thing because it was years later when he got me into Konami. I had gone back to Japan, was teaching English for a year. Lost that job after. They didn't ask me to re-up. So I was like, oh fuck. By that time, though, my twin brother was at Konami in America, in Chicago, and he arranged for me to get an interview in Japan with and I went there and I, gushed over what a big Konami fan I was. Contra changed my life, this kind of stuff. And so I got a job at Konami in Japan. And so for the next 2 years, I was working in the international business department in Konami Japan, while my twin brother was working in Konami Chicago. And we had a lot of fun putting secret twin messages in our international faxes, It was a lot of fun.
So while you're at Konami, what were the first projects that you worked on, game-wise?
First ones, well, I'm not sure I can come up with them in order, but there was like stuff like Animaniacs and Tiny Looney Tunes or Tiny Toons, different adventures, and there was Contra Games Hardcore, and there was Sparkster, a couple different Sparksters from Sega. And at the time, Sega and the Sega division and the Nintendo division were two different divisions. One of them was working in Kansai in Kobe. That was the Super Nintendo division, and the Sega division was here in Tokyo.
Well, that's kind of
And a
interesting.
lot of them, yeah, it is kind of interesting. They're very, very different, organizations in a lot of ways. They were, and it really showed in their games. And a lot of times we would get a license or something like Sparkster, and the two groups would make their own versions of a game. You look at Animaniacs for Super Nintendo and Animaniacs for Sega, totally different. Same thing for
Like Ninja Turtles.
Sparkster. I don't remember that Ninja Turtles came out. I could be wrong.
Yeah, that
I think Ninja Turtles was Nintendo exclusive, but
no, there's a Genesis version as well.
is there?
Yeah.
And Contra, I think.
It's not nowhere as well known.
Yeah,
Yeah, because
Yeah.
there's Contra 3 and Contra Hardcore.
yeah.
Completely different games.
Yeah. And let's see, there was Biker Mice from Mars, which I was instrumental in getting the license for that because they had to, was the only person who could speak English.
So did you work back and forth between the two Nintendo and Sega divisions then, doing translations?
I was mostly Sega, but being in the international division, we would get a daily fax from Konami America and Konami Europe with different things like where's our order, and we found a bug, or fans are we got a big problem with it. There's this part in Contra that's too difficult,
Oh, wow.
Send us a sample ROM of this new game, these different things. And we would every morning get up and look at the faxes. There was no email then.
Yeah.
There was no email back in those days. We put the notes on a pigeon.
Had to crank it out with your old printing press.
Yeah.
So what's like the process? So they make a game like Sparkster, for example, and then they want to do a U.S. release. So where do you come into the process, and then what's your process with the 16-bit games?
Well, the process would begin with an idea, next year's lineup of games.
Okay.
And R&D would have to allocate their resources. All right, we'll have 5 titles next year, or we have 6 titles next year. We've got this many R&D lines, and we've got these licensed games, so we have to use 2 lines for these licensed games. We're gonna give one team to for the purposes of of overseas games, for example.
Okay.
Sega was more oriented for overseas market because there wasn't a lot of, I think there was more Sega sold in overseas than there were in Japan, for example.
Yeah, for sure.
So so Nintendo was basically the domestic ones. That's why I had more to do with Sega.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and then the overseas guys would have some input about the lineup and what games they might be interested in. Then they'd go into the R&D, they'd go into the development, and when at the point that they had something to show, we would burn a ROM and send it in the mail.
So you're involved from the beginning, from the idea phase then?
Yeah. Although, I wasn't. Remember, we're not in R&D. We are. Although that's what I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. Inexplicably, I was put into the business division, and also handled things like shipping, which I was unable to really do professionally. I wanted to be in R&D, and more and more though, R&D started to come to me with, what do you think about this, Jeremy? Because I'm the only American, the only Westerner. Yeah. What do you think about this? Can you translate these, lines of dialogue? Translate this message.
So you were like the token guy.
Yeah, I was like the token guy. I don't want to say the token guy. Yeah, sort of.
Okay. Well, let's just, we're gonna call it spade a spade here. Like when they, they had questions that, they'd come to you.
Yeah.
Would this work in America?
Yeah, I represented all.
You were like the cultural gatekeeper.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so R&D wanted to bring me over into R&D, but again, inexplicably the weirdo. I didn't say that. I did not say that. Inexplicably, the esteemed president of Konami wanted me to stay in the business division. At which point I finally just said, peas in a bucket, fuck it, I'm leaving. because I actually wanted to make games, you know.
Yeah.
So anyway, so yeah, I was sort of involved from the beginning, but it was more like communicating the overseas point of view. And when I finally did get help, you know, asked to help with R&D, it was great. I mean, for example, Animaniacs, Sega. I mean, I actually, how did that even work? I remember that was one of the first games that I had a lot of input on because, you know, also maybe Sparkster.
Which is a fantastic game.
Biker Mice from I remember Biker Mice from Mars. I was the one that me and this other guy, we were the ones that sort of pushed them to do the 3/4 view, which was something we were really enamored of at the time. Animaniacs, I wrote all these funny jokes for the Sega version, all the puns in there. You know, there's some kind of funny shit.
Oh,
there.
yes. I grew up with the Genesis Animaniacs. It was one of my staples.
Oh, did you?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I put in these funny, like, you know, insider jokes for me and my brother. We're really into Jethro Tull. Stages is called Bungle in the Jungle. You might remember.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
Yeah,
awesome.
different things like that. You know.
So you had a lot of free reign over that kind of stuff.
Over some of them, yeah, some of them, I was lucky enough to be able to work my insidious little things. And then, of course, there was Snatcher, which was a big change for me.
Yeah. Actually, I do have a quick question before we talk about Snatcher, because I know we'll want to talk about that. Was there ever a game that never made it to America that you really wish that would have fit in our culture?
Well, I don't know about fitting in our culture, you know, but I didn't really think that at that point. I guess I didn't. At some point, I started to feel like, you know, this whole business about fitting into our culture might be overrated because,
You know, the way globalization, the way the worlds are now, you know, taste is
yeah,
more
now
common.
you can do that.
So
Yeah,
you're
now,
catching on to that.
yeah,
There's gonna
because
be a boom of people interested in like Eastern culture and stuff.
you know, I don't think at the time it was that. I think it was more like, you know, there's a process of dilution when you ask, or when you try to force things into belong. I mean, the R&D teams were making really weird shit, like, you know, like Parodius. You take a look at Parodius, it's like these guys like dropped acid and made that game or something. Very weird. Or Goemon, you know, you play Goemon for Super Nintendo. Fucking great game.
Mystical Ninja.
Yeah, and yet, you know, like, was anything actually gained by calling it Mystical Ninja?
No.
Yeah.
Fun game though.
Actually, I didn't even. So Goemon did come over.
I played it on an emulator, fan translated.
Oh.
Yeah, so that it
Oh.
did eventually.
Yeah, but I don't.
Mystical. So I think Mystical Ninja was a name that was applied to like an earlier Goemon game, right?
I think there's one for the Super Nintendo that made it here, and one for the Nintendo 64 that made it here.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm talking about the Super Nintendo version. But I think there was versions before that too. And that I think Mystical Ninja came from an earlier, maybe even a Nintendo, you know, Famicom game. I'm not sure, but I don't think that Super Goemon for the SNES came out in the US, but I might be wrong. Anyway, so other games that didn't make it. Yeah, I mean,
like any
sure.
standouts.
Yeah, like, I mean, well, how about Tokimeki, you know? I mean, Tokimeki came out, when Tokimeki came out, it was pretty groundbreaking. And now there have been so many copies, but this is a game that is a perfect example of something that the R&D guys really making something that they love, that was tailored to a Japanese audience, but that absolutely zero consideration was given to even the idea that it might be accepted overseas, because it just, the Japanese have these who they are and who Americans are, or who Westerners are, and they're sort of set in stone. Germany, the country that doesn't like violence. So European version, we, you know, we'll put, you know, we'll make the blood green for what the fuck game was that? I don't remember. I remember we had to make blood green for some game, you know. But the West, you know, huh?
Because of a European release.
Yeah, because
I was just saying Sega was usually pretty good with allowing blood and stuff. I know. I think wasn't
Germany
specifically.
Germany was a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so Tokimeki anyway. Oh, and the other stereotype was that we can't sell RPGs, can't sell in the, you know, in the Western market. You know, it's only for Japan.
Yeah.
Right now, was part of that the fact that it took so much extra effort to translate RPGs over to the US? No. Where they had to have larger meg-size cartridges?
Well, I mean, Konami didn't originally do RPGs, and it wasn't until Square broke it open that there was any even discussion about the viability of RPGs. I remember my superior in the international business department pushing for sports games, and we're like, Konami sports? Konami and sports, they just don't go together.
Konami and shooters,
you know. Yeah, Konami shooters.
Now you said that Snatcher was a big turning point for you, and as a gamer, for me it was a big turning point too, because the game blew my mind. So I have it on Sega CD, which is the only official English translation, surprisingly, that the United States ever seen. I think that's another genre, adventure games like that are real text-based, that never really came out. Like the sequel never came out in the U.S. at all, in an official English translation. There's plenty of fan translations. So what was the process on that like, and why was that a turning point for you?
Wait, we're talking about Snatcher here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I sort of spaced out on you there for a second.
It's okay.
I thought you said something about official release and.
Yeah, so the Sega CD version was the only official U.S. English release of the game.
Yeah, because you know we didn't have the no, there was no game system that could handle the size of it other than the Sega CD.
And so you said that was a turning point for you. How was it a turning point?
Well, it was a turning point as both a gamer and in my profession, really. The story of that was basically I was called down to come to the Sega R&D building and try this game out to see if I thought it was viable for the U.S. market. And they sat me down at a desk with a Sega Drive, a Sega CD, a Mega Drive CD, which I'd never touched before, and so I'd never played a CD-ROM game. And put on the headphones and started to play Snatcher, and yeah, I mean, I was blown away in a way that you may think you were blown away, but probably you weren't, because you never had the experience as an adult of playing a game for the first time that had voices for the first time. You grew up in this environment. For me, I'm going
for the first time I played a game with voices.
Yeah, I mean,
it would have been like the Sega. It would have been the 16-bit days when they started to digitize voices.
yeah,
Sonic
it
comes up and says Sega, but that's not like as to the extent of voiceover.
Yeah, I want to say the first voicing that I can recall from a video game would be like, for me at least, Mortal Kombat. But those were like little clips.
That doesn't count. I mean,
it was like little clips. It wasn't like full Like it wasn't like
Yeah.
acting or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, there was voices in arcade games when I was,
Yeah.
really young too. Like,
Sinistar.
fuck Tron.
Shark Attack.
Yeah, Xevious, Tron, but no, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like emotionally impactful, scenes.
Yeah.
So that's the first
Oh.
time you saw that.
Yeah, so Snatcher, was a total turning point for me in the realization that games could have an emotional impact like that, and could tell a narrative.
And a really complex narrative.
Yeah, I simply hadn't considered it,
Yeah, I mean, it's basically kind of like a mix between a novel and a movie in one game. And so, what about as developers? Did you do the translating for the U.S. version on that?
No, I didn't have time to translate anything like that because, I'm working full time for the business department. Remember, if I was in an R&D, sure, I would have done it. But no, I was asked to find a translator and then manage it, with deadlines, and then review it and do any extra. Actually, I should say I joined R&D for. I was temporarily loaned to R&D for. Oh, I don't know, maybe 2 months, maybe 3 months during the conversion process. So I was actually, yeah, I did work in R&D during that time. But a lot of extra text had to be written too. That wasn't just translated. So that's where I snuck in all my little secret Easter eggs and stuff like that. And then when the text came back, I checked it all over and made any changes that were necessary. So I didn't translate it per se, but I did a lot of writing on it and that sort of thing. And then we had to do the voiceover, of course, which was really a big turning point for me because I directed for the first time. Actually, I think I had gone to America to direct Contra Hardcore, but the amount of voices in that is so minimal that it hardly counts. No, Snatcher was, I was thrown into this situation where I was asked to direct this long. I mean, it has hours and hours of voice.
Did you get to pick the actors and stuff too? Were you involved in that process?
No, my brother in Chicago found the studio to do it at, and like it's often the case that a recording studio has a group of actors that they're used to working with. They tend to get regular clients, and then they tend to have a sort of group of actors that they know. So I guess the studio had picked up these actors, and when I got there to Chicago, we had to see who was going to do what. So we had like 12 people or 10 people or whatever, and I had the script and I knew what voices we needed, but I had to allocate out no, there wasn't 10. What am I saying? There was more like 6, and there wasn't enough to cover. People had to do multiple voices, and I had to figure out who could do what and how we were going to do it. Metal Gear, shit.
Yeah.
Can any of you guys do a robot voice? Okay, let me hear what you got. Okay, let me hear your detective voice. Okay, all right, you'll be Gillian. Okay.
And for that era, like if you look back at Sega CD games, it's some of the best voice acting. It's probably the best voice acting on the system, bar none.
I have no doubt that it's the best.
Yeah, bar none. It's got great performances, and if anyone's listening to this who hasn't played Snatcher, you owe it to yourself.
Yeah, and and if you do play it, yeah, there's a couple clinkers in there for sure, but there's some really, really, really the great acting and humorous acting far outweighs the bad stuff.
Yeah, plus combined with the atmosphere and the settings and the graphics. How different is what I played on Sega CD versus what you played in the Japanese version, do you think?
I think that one thing I've noticed about Japanese voice acting, um, that's true to this day, even if you look at like Metal Gear and stuff like that, um, is that now this is just kind of describing a feeling, because when I listen to the Japanese voice acting, I'm understanding it. Okay. And when I offer my opinion of what it feels like, it's just a personal opinion, to me, because how Japanese people receive it, you got to understand it's based on, and the same thing for how you receive, voice acting or any acting. Kind of under the surface, there's all these, there's decades and decades of watching TV and watching movies, and the things that spur your emotional response are all based on what you brought, what you've watched up to this point.
There's like a shorthand.
Yeah, it's like a shorthand. I mean, if you hear someone doing a cheesy Clint Eastwood imitation, like Metal Gear, for example,
Right.
You're interpreting that as, oh, it's tough guy. If you hear a guy do a Brooklyn accent, he's a tough guy. If you hear so there's all these kind of shorthand connotations that we have. Now in Japanese, when you listen to the voice acting in general, I think that God, it's so hard to describe. I think they all tend to sound the same. For example, a male lead role sounds to me sort of emotionally disaffected, like removed from the action, but cool in a different way,
Or more
Gillian,
stoic.
Stoic, yeah, stoic, or yeah, more stoic, you could say. Yeah, 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 and less emotionally involved.
So would you
Yeah.
say it's easier to categorize like the different kinds of roles? They
Mhm.
have these like
Yeah,
it's a very standard method,
yeah. I
uh,
think, yep. I
of
think
that,
that's
and
that's
you can sort of say so in that way you can say, oh well, this is our tsundere character, and then
well, yeah. Now,
they know what
yeah,
that means, and then you have
exactly.
that background that's the shorthand, but it's sort of like the role is cast so neatly in that
That's really
box.
well put. Yeah, that's well put, Daniel. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. It's really clear when you talk about the Bishojo games too.
Mhm.
That there are these stereotypes that characters fit into,
Mhm.
and
But
so
it's sort of
I
like a
think you
way
probably
you can learn more without having to say it's saying less,
yeah,
you
exactly,
know.
exactly, and they're more difficult to define in English.
Because we don't
Um,
really have that same sort of. I mean, like we have some things like like a valley girl is a valley girl. You have
right?
like a stoner. You can kind of like catch things like a surfer vibe. You have like
Yeah,
there are some things, but they're not as wide.
yeah, yeah.
You know.
Yeah, and it's true. It's true in the text as well.
Mhm.
Japanese is, had all these years of manga, and it's very, very easy in Japanese to write text that describes those, the way a sentence ends or something like that, inflections and stuff in written text makes it clear what the character is, who they are, what age group, what
Mhm.
social group. In
Exactly.
English, it's much more difficult, and so going from Japanese to English, you run into that problem all the time.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, so to answer your question about are you playing the same thing? No, you never are, You certainly are not. And that's why a localization, and if there's one thing I want people to understand when we touch upon this big, often discussed debate about translations, that is inescapable is the hand of the translator. As much as fans want to say, I want the original thing. It's like, well, go learn Japanese. That's the only way you're getting the original thing. Otherwise, you're getting more of me then you're getting the original thing, you know. And the only part of the original thing you're really getting is the big picture.
Like the
You know,
plot
the
and the
way
story.
yeah, I mean, think about translating a poem for a second. You know, you've got the meaning, of course, but then you've got the, you know, you've got the rhyme scheme and the tempo and the you know, the nuance of the language. You translate a poem. What do you translate? Do you focus? Okay, I'm going to nail this tempo. Okay, I'm going to nail this, you know, rhyme scheme. Okay, I'm going to, you know, cover the meaning. But in Japanese, of course, the word order is backwards. So, you know.
So really, the
You know,
person who's done the translation, it's almost like their original work in a way.
yeah, I mean, I'd like to say I'm the writer of these things that I've translated by myself. Of course, I can't say that I'm the writer, but it feels like it is the process of writing, you know, and you just have to refer to the original to guide you as to what your boundaries are. You know, you've got these boundaries and you got to fit in the boundaries, but you have to write something that sounds good and the audience likes, you know. So I'm sorry, last Snatcher question.
Oh yeah, do you still have a copy? Because that thing goes for like $400 these days.
Yeah, you know what? I've given my copy to my nephew, and he says he can't find it. So what I have now is I've got like a reproduced.
Oh yeah.
I've got a, you know, version of the Sega CD. Yeah.
Somebody listening should send you one. Because do we have you to thank for it getting over to here? So is it like, because you said they asked you if it would go in the U.S. Obviously you said yes. So was it mostly on your shoulders?
It was completely on my shoulders.
Oh well, thank you.
Yeah.
We give you a personal thanks, because that was big in my life.
Yeah.
Playing
I'm not sure I made such a good business decision.
I'm okay with that.
For the secondhand market, you've made a lot of resellers very rich off of Snatcher.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously they didn't bring Police Knots over, but you know, they ported it in Japan, the Saturn and PlayStation, a bunch of other things.
Yeah. Police Knots. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't find the game till I was an adult Snatcher, but I'm very happy I've played it.
I'm glad. I'm glad.
Yeah, I think I got it in like 2001. A good deal on it too, and it's never left my sight. That game is wonderful. All right, so we got
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say I wonder why, you know, why it was never really, you know, updated or brought over. You know, I mean, all the fan appeal for it. It seems like it should have been. You know, I think what happened was, you know, Kojima borrowed so much from, you know, Terminator and Blade Runner from it that it probably would be embarrassing to, you know, release on a scale that Metal Gear Solid is. You know.
Well, I mean, maybe, but I mean, it's still an original story. I'm surprised that it hasn't come out on a compilation or on Steam or something. Like, you know, it could be, you know, like a bonus and like a Metal Gear Solid re-release or a greatest hits game.
Yeah, I mean,
something like that.
The graphics are so low res, though. You know, it would just look ridiculous, probably. You know.
I don't know, but maybe.
Yeah.
Sega's making a lot of money right now, re-releasing a lot of their Genesis stuff on Steam. They sold like 320,000 like Genesis packages in the past couple months.
Wow.
Mega Drive, yeah, this stuff is popular.
Wow. Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, you know, it's like, I think, especially when you're talking about, I mean, the whole game industry is so interesting now to me because, you know, mobile games have you know, sort of brought us back in terms of game development to these really simple format games.
Yeah.
And developers aren't anywhere near as good as they used to be at working within, you know, within limitations, stage mechanics and that sort of thing. And so I was looking at this preview of Mighty Number 9.
Okay.
You know. Yeah, I mean, have you seen that yet?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That looks awesome.
I was like, yeah, I was like, what the fuck? I mean, in 1991, people would have, laughed at it. It's not good enough for 1991. How is this, coming out in 2016? Like, it's
Wow.
weird. So I'm not surprised that Sega is,
Well, I think
Kahn's hardcore, man.
I
Fuck,
think
trying
back in
to
the
make
day,
that now.
No, you couldn't, because I think it goes to your point that the game, like what's popular, what sells, has gone so far away from that formula of running gun and good like level mechanics and those kind of core game mechanics that a lot of people don't know how to do it well. I'm not saying it can't be done well. I'm not saying there aren't some good games out there that do it very well, but it just feels like it's less. And the guys who I think do it really well are the guys who are doing homebrews and who are making new games for like old systems because they're working with that old hardware
Yeah.
and stuff.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Daniel, what were you gonna say?
I think we sort of have like it's kind of like this like curse that we have too many games coming out and releasing all the time that
Yeah.
they want a game and you play through it in a weekend and then you move on to the next thing. So for a schedule of okay, we need to have, this is what we're going to put out this year, back then is a much
Yeah.
shorter list than now,
Yeah.
where it's like we need to have this giant team for a game that is going to be, a 10-hour experience, and the longevity of the title is not so important because there's going to be another game, in the next, the next fiscal year or whatever. So
yeah, and let's also not test it. Let's release it buggy and then we'll patch it later. Now we're getting off
there's
topic.
a lot of things with that. So
Yeah. No, what you say is totally true. People run through fucking apps, like,
but I mean, at
crazy.
the same time, like there was only so many games that were released for Sega or Nintendo or what have
Yeah.
you, and so and a lot of people, their budgets when it came to video gaming was very different. Their allowances, if you will, if that existed at all. So you'd maybe get like a few games a year. Now
Yeah.
people have so many games per year that they just they buy maybe one or two every month, something.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you don't even own them. We used to
Yeah,
own the fucking
right?
games. When you bought a game, you owned that motherfucker.
Yeah, I am totally with you on that. So right now, that's like a divisive issue in gaming. Because I
Oh,
grew
I
up,
hate it.
in the 16-bit days, and for me to spend money on downloading a game is hard for me because I don't have that in my hand, and I can't sell that if I wanted to. What do I own? I own I guess a license, and as long as the developer doesn't discontinue supplying the game, I can re-download it later, I guess.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, it's hard for me.
That's
Oh, I
actually
hate it. I
that's
hate it. I hate free to play. I hate in-game purchases. I despise it. I hate subscriptions.
Yeah,
I hate it. Yeah.
it's I guess it's where we are today. But let's go back to some reader questions. We have some great reader questions.
All right.
So the first one, it talks about how you worked on Symphony of the Night,
Mm.
and what was the inspiration for having Dracula quote the French philosopher Andre Malraux, and I may be saying that name wrong. And
Yeah.
was that you, or was that coming from, Konami?
No, it was me. Actually, when Igarashi found out about it, he was kind of pissed. I heard, he's not, he wasn't too pleased with it. But the inspiration, the reason I did it was, first of all, you have to understand the background, which is very different than now. Okay.
Yeah.
Back then, you would never have played a Japanese version of a game. Back then, you never would have read on the internet that there was that anything about the Japanese game. Back then,
Yeah, if you saw anything, it'd be a little blurb in like EGM that it was on
yeah, it would
like
be a screenshot.
TurboGrafx
You
CD
might have
or
seen,
something.
Yeah, you might
no,
see
you
a
might have seen a
screenshot.
screenshot in GameSpot of the Japanese game,
Yeah.
But the idea that the English has to be exactly the same as the Japanese, it never occurred to most of us, because we just consider them different products. Really, I mean, of, other than the game mechanics and stuff like that and the story, we I don't think anyone felt that um, anyone wanted it had to be an exact match or anything like that. It wasn't that I was trying to change the thing was the Japanese is very, very boring in that exchange.
Mm.
It's really boring. It's like some kind of boilerplate, kind of like meaningless blather. I mean, it's just not interesting. It's I don't know, maybe you can find it somewhere. It's at the time I read it and I was going to translate it, and I was just like, wow, this is really anticlimactic. It's just, we're here in this opening scene and fucking, Dracula's supposed to be fucking talking, and I'm trying to get in the mood of this, like, 18th century, 19th century, thing. And I tried to write it in an archaic style, which backfired, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But in my mind, I'm playing the text over. I'm hearing people, utter the lines that I'm saying, and I have this imaginary way it's going to go. And this Dracula part is just, it was boring, and I'm thinking, well, he should speak in it, in an epic style, and what he was saying in the Japanese just wasn't going to be it. It was just boring. So somehow I guess I had a book from the library of great quotes or something like this, and I was trying to think of how Dracula would feel looking down from above, down on mortals. I wasn't thinking of myself so much as a translator then, but as a person who was trying to deliver an impactful, version of this scene.
Also, I'm
And
sure
I
that
didn't feel,
the character Dracula, I mean, in Western culture, is way more fleshed out.
yeah, I think that's probably
No,
true too.
I mean,
And
it's
yeah,
so you
yeah,
have like
right.
you have more mythos for people to play around with that because it's more familiar.
Yeah, I mean, remember, that's true. Like, I'm carrying a sense of Dracula, and you have a sense of Dracula, and ours is probably much, much more similar than the Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
You know, um, but anyway, so that was the inspiration, and it's just I found the Japanese was really flat, and I don't know, actually somewhere I saw some discussion of this. There's someone who, if you do a search on this, you'll find, I think, the original text, and some Japanese guy or some who speaks Japanese about that. Oh, I remember where it was. Yeah, yeah. Oh, it was on it was on like a game translation blog. This guy who writes about game translation.
Oh, I might know the one.
What did he call himself? He calls himself the something or other localizer, or the something or other.
Well, even if he was pissed at you for that line, I feel like you got the last laugh because it's become so iconic in Castlevania.
I know. No, he wasn't pissed. He actually sort of understood it.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, now there's so much discussion about legends of localization.
Yeah. He did a book about Legend of Zelda, and then I think he's coming out with one about Earthbound.
Yeah, how come this guy? I'm not a legend of localization.
Well, I think you're gonna be getting in there, because I think it's starting out. I mean, Zelda 1, NES, and then you got Super Nintendo.
Yeah, realistically, with your list of games, I believe you are the legend of localization.
Oh yeah, I would definitely say
you're on our list for sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, so he kind of understood, but the thing is like there wasn't any. I mean, we didn't have the word localization. There was no video game translators back then, and there was no discussion of the idea that there should be a one-to-one matchup of a translation. There was no one that was going to play both versions. It was just a really different time, you know. And I just wanted to give something good to the audience that I thought they would like. And it turned out I must have done something right because although
Here we are.
although part of it has to do with the incredibly terrible job that was done on the voice recording.
That's the follow up. How do you feel about the voice acting?
It's epically bad. It's one of the worst things I've ever heard.
And you had I'm guessing it had nothing to do with it too.
I had zero to do with it, but I know who did, and I will not say his name.
Oh, whenever my wife and I get to the last boss in a game or whatever, we always do the "die monster." It's just so ingrained now in me.
It's bad on so many levels. I don't even, for one thing, it sounds like it was recorded in a bathtub.
Yeah,
you know?
I think the Dracula part at the beginning, I think he does all right with saying that line. I've always felt that he did fine, but Rainer?
Is it Richter?
It was not by my hand that you were given flesh.
I love that line.
So I tried to write. I tried to write it in an archaic style, and in my mind, I imagine good voice actors as opposed to really, really shitty voice actors.
Yeah, it's interesting how you did Snatcher had such good voice acting. I think that was 94, right? They came out finally, and then as the optical media started to progress, games on CDI, 3DO, other Sega CD games, and then PlayStation, Saturn, it just became known for bad voice acting up until about the early 2000s again, when it started to really change.
Yeah,
there's exceptions. There's exceptions. Obviously, Snatcher's one. It's like Snowdrop on 3DO is pretty good.
Do you want to know why that happened?
Can I guess?
Yeah.
I'm guessing a lot of the times they just had the secretary do it or something, or the developers, and they don't want to spend money on good voice actors. That's my guess. What's the real answer?
I would say it's not that.
Okay.
It's not primarily that. I mean, it might be that in some cases, but no, primarily I see it as a function of the fact that for one thing, voice actors, of course, there's a whole range of voice actors, but for the most part, when you ask a guy to come into the booth and record lines, for the most part, they just want to get out of there. I mean, they just want they just want to read the lines, not hurt their voices, and get a paycheck. And so the job of a director is to make sure that you get what you want, right? So you have to squeeze out of the voice actor the performance, unless you have this, really 1 out of 10 guys who, is so committed to, let me have another chance to do it. But the other thing is time is money when you've booked a studio, and you've only got an hour to get, this many. Next guy's coming into this hour, and we can only afford this much. We've only booked the studio for this many days. We've got to get it done. So you're facing that, and then you're facing a voice actor who comes in and says, "Okay, what am I doing today? Okay, it looks like what? Okay, taxi driver, got it." And then he reads the line. He's never read the line before, and he just reads it. He has no idea the context, So the only way you're going to get a good performance is if the director goes in there and he knows what he wants, or she. He's got the idea in his mind, and he holds that standard up against what he heard from the voice actor and says, no, that doesn't work right, because in this scene, he's already supposed to know that Joe is dead, or something like this, No, it's more sarcastic, No, you don't sound like you're emotionally invested in, in that. Or, you're more angry here, you have to make those corrections, and that requires energy and caring about what you're doing. Now, if you take the number of people that have both energy and caring and knowledge of the context, and time and given the responsibility to make decisions, you're coming down with a very, very small list of, people. So, in the case of this Castlevania disaster, for one thing, the guy was Japanese who directed it. And although he can speak pretty good English, apparently he's unable to. I couldn't direct to Japanese. Shit would get past me that, the speed that you go in a recording, shit would get past me, and I wouldn't realize, oh, he should have said, Janae or instead of Janai, or he should have stressed the word koto there. I wouldn't get those minor things. So I'm not surprised that it sucked. He shouldn't have been put in that position. And the reason that I did good stuff with Snatcher, and the extent that I influenced the first Metal Gear Solid was because I had written the lines, and I knew exactly how I wanted them to sound and how they would need to sound in order to, fit. And so I had to drive my energy into the voice actors of Silent Hill 2, I'd say, because Silent Hill 2 and 3 and 4, I had to put a lot of energy into getting what I wanted from the voice actors. And the less professional the voice actors are, the more you need to demand and keep pushing them until you get what you want. And so when you don't get something you want, it's either you didn't recognize that it was no good, or you didn't put enough energy into it. So that's why.
All right, so the follow-up question is, how do you feel about the retranslation done for the PSP version, if you're familiar with it?
For Castlevania? I don't know. I'm familiar with the fact that they, backed off on some of the stuff I did, but I don't really know the extent of it. If did they remove What Is a Man?
No, they did not.
They'd be idiots too,
Yeah, that's so iconic that it's in the most recent Castlevania game, Lord of Shadows 2, with I can't remember the actor's name, but he's an Academy Award nominated actor playing Dracula, and the game starts with the "What is a man but a pile."
An Academy nominated award actor.
Yeah, he was
really?
not. Yeah, he was in the movie. I think he was nominated in that movie Full Monty that came out in like '94.
Yeah, someone's got to give me that name. I'd like to know that.
He's in that show Once Upon a Time right now. He plays Rumpelstiltskin, and I don't know why he's drawing a blank on his name. It's Scottish.
God, I'd love to hear it. But it's funny to make knowyourmemes.com and not be sure whether or not it was because it was an epic disaster or an epic choice. I mean, or am I just straddling the line between, it was epic on some form, but I don't know if it was like that was, like it's being complete mockery or what. It doesn't matter. I mean, it ultimately doesn't matter. All that matters is that you get a reaction, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So the next question is about the Silent Hill trilogy, and so the question is who did the writing for the English puzzles? Was it you, or was it Owaku?
Who? Who was
Owaku.
Oh, Owaku-san? No, it was me. How would he write the English puzzles?
There you go.
Guy
Asked and answered.
Guy can't put 3 words in English together. Seriously.
So were they mostly based off of the Japanese, or
He reads English fairly well, but he certainly can't write any English. No, it was from the Japanese, and I had to figure out. In some cases, I never became clear on actually how the puzzle was going to work, and maybe he wasn't clear at the time that he wrote the Japanese, or maybe there was some tinkering afterwards to make shit fit. So I think there's some stuff that just couldn't be made to work. Like there's at least one puzzle that I see now didn't work. I can't remember which one it is, but just doesn't. It's just some really complex puzzle about. Oh yeah, I remember which one it is. There's a poem, and it describes all these different parts of the face. You know, like cheek and your eye and different things like this. It's this twisted kind of like stalker poem, and the poem came out great. I mean, it's not really a poem per se. It's like a letter. It's a stalkery kind of letter. I've looked into these things that I wrote, and I'm pretty proud of them. But this one didn't. I think at the time I didn't know that was going to be used as a puzzle.
And was that the one in Silent Hill 2 or Silent Hill 4?
Not 4, maybe 3, but I'm pretty sure it's 2.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's 2.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I didn't know that was going to be. I didn't know that was going to be a puzzle, and I think it maps out like the face onto a keyboard. You know, like you have to touch this and then this and then that actually is 2 and 3, 4, 7, or I think it didn't work, but there was a couple of songs that I had another translator do. She did a great job. Here, I think it's the Lunatic's Letter. At least that's what I called it.
I think I remember which puzzle you're talking about. It's been
it goes pure eyes, blue like glassy beads.
Yep.
You were always looking at me, and I'm always looking at you. It's really, really creepy, creepy writing, and I love it. But no, I wrote the puzzles. I had to figure out how it was going to work, and they were challenging, really, really, really challenging to make something work after translation. Like those fucking coins. Fuck.
Like what?
The coin.
Yeah,
the coins.
that was our comment afterwards.
Yeah.
What is it? The coin.
Actually, to quote the guy, the follow-up comments, that was the fucking coin puzzle though. Always gave me a headache on the harder difficulties.
I think it gave you a headache, man. Or the Bard's puzzle, the Shakespeare one. Shit.
Oh.
Shit, man, I should have been given like a bonus for that. Or the tarot puzzle.
Yeah,
I mean, that goes above and beyond the Call of Duty, man.
There's a lot of hard ass puzzles in those games. Fuck.
That's genius level shit. I mean, that's genius level shit. Let me tell you, I should have gotten an award for that.
Was that one of your most challenging jobs you've ever done?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think it was the most challenging job?
If it wasn't the most challenging, I can't think what the most challenging was.
Well, I think that's a yes. All right.
Yeah,
so
I can't recall anything more challenging.
The next user asks, how long did it take you to feel like you had enough handle on the language, or you've mastered enough to be able to do this kind of work?
How long did it take? I mean, that's kind of hard to answer.
Because obviously you were working when you thought.
Yeah, it took it. Yeah, it required several years of formal Japanese study. It required several years of working in a company so that I was, completely immersed. And it probably required several years of marriage to a Japanese person. So I don't know. I mean, until you have that much experience with how Japanese people speak and living in the culture, probably you shouldn't be doing serious translation, I would like to say.
Would you say you were always kind of learning as you went on?
Yeah, I mean, I was first going to joke by saying, "Oh, when did I first feel comfortable? What time is it now?" So, yeah. It's kind of a question you can't answer because it's going to vary from person to person too, and of course then there's also your ability to you can sort of find anything on the internet now, right?
Yeah.
And so depending upon how strict your standards are for confirming that you've got something right, you could get away with translating something without all that experience I said, I suppose. And then there's also your philosophical view of what translation is. I mean, it seems like there's a pretty big gap between how I feel about it and what some fans think that they want. So if you just want a direct translation of what something says, run it through Google Translate and then correct, or something like that. But for me, there's a lot more than just the direct meaning of something. There's all these, things implied by nuance that, unless you know the different ways that the same thing could be said, if I said, give me a drink of water, I could say it in, 6 different ways in Japanese, and each of one of them would have a different, would say different things about how I think about you and my relationship. Particularly in Japanese, verbs have these. You conjugate verb endings in ways that express the relationship between the receiver of an action and the giver of an action, and carry all these, all this baggage and meta information about who I am and who I think you are and what our relationship is. So
I think it's sort of like actually hearing when you hear something, what it is, it's vibrations, and the muscles in your ear, they interpret that and then make it into a signal you can understand on a mental level. So it's just another layer of that. Is you're taking the base of what it is, the base material, and it's encoding it, and then so that we can decode it culturally.
Are you stoned right now?
No, I just.
He's just like that, man.
I'm just. Sometimes I can get to the heart of a matter. You know what I mean?
No, I'm just joking.
You don't think about it too much, but you know what? I'm just like shit.
No, it's all true. It just reminded me of like a stoned college conversation.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, definitely. Because you know what it is. This is the thing. For everyone in
there it is, man.
Here, let me lay it out.
Wow.
So
it's like there's like no division between us,
Well, okay, so I feel like part of part of the human experience as more than one person, as a race of many, or a tribe of billions, is that part of it is we have to interact with one another, and the whole point of that is perspective. So what you are is you're a broker of perspective, man. And so what that is you gotta place yourself in someone else's position. And for everyone, all right. This is where we break down. For everything that there is, it is the most important thing in the world to somebody. It might be your dog. It might be an enchilada. It might be, the weather. It's something is the most loved favorite thing for someone else. And if you can have that thought and then try and find that perspective that person says this is the thing that
I think
life is about.
Yeah,
you can understand things.
I've thought about it a lot. And the way I would put it is this: that language is this, like, in a way, it's just an imprecise representation of this. Of course, we can't have thoughts without language, but we have desires, without language, and we have feelings without language, and the way that we express those feelings or desires can only be done through language. But behind it all, is this uber thing, which is the concrete thing behind the language. It's a feeling, or it's an emotion, or it's a memory of when we were kids, and that's trying to be expressed through these limited words. And since we don't have the the words are symbols, just like if you draw a symbol of a dog, it's not a dog, but there's something behind it, which is this dog reality, right? And your picture only represents it. So the lines also only represent something that's floating out there that is not the language itself, but is the feelings or
representative of it.
Yeah. And so my job is to evoke or to create the same reality that the author wanted to express through his symbols, that I recreate through the use of the English symbols. But ultimately, I have to be serving not the false Japanese symbols, which are again just a representation of a reality behind it. I'm not trying to simply deal with those symbols. I'm trying to deal with what's behind those symbols. So what some people may be missing when they think that translation is just exchanging symbols for symbols, it is and it isn't. It's also understanding what the author's intent was, what's really behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. So next user question is when you're working on a sequel to a game that you didn't translate the original version for, like Silent Hill 2, you did Phoenix Wright 3, or even Metal Gear Solid was a sequel. How do you proceed? Yeah. How do you proceed? Do you go back and like play the old games, or do you have like a process for that?
You don't usually have time to do something like that. I mean, in most cases, I don't even play the game I'm translating.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, it's a rare case when I get to, and I think that's true for most people if they were actually describing the reality of the situation. There's just so much time pressure and resource pressure. They say we got to get this started on Monday, and we need it done in 8 weeks or 11 weeks or whatever. Do you have a copy of the game? No, fuck, the game's not even, they're still working on it, so no, you usually don't get to play the game. And so you do the research that you need to do to make sure that you're, maintaining consistency. I mean, I remember I did a large part of Phoenix Wright, a Phoenix Wright game, I did several of the pieces of Trials and Tribulations. And it's funny because I didn't know what the hell I was, jumping into. There was so much backstory and I didn't know, I didn't have, the graphics to look at to know whether this was shit. In Japanese, there's no plural. Someone says, dog. You don't know if it's dogs or dog. As one example, right? So I remember, huh?
Contextually, that's pretty important.
Yeah, it's pretty fucking important, So fortunately, the internet, and I remember there's this incredible Phoenix Wright fan site. It's just unbelievable. It's the most unbelievable thing I ever saw. And these guys on this fan site had laboriously put up every single JPEG of every single item and indexed them. So I was able to do the site, they're such fans that they've taken the Japanese version. And this is all, so far and above what the client was able to provide. So it's funny, the relationship that exists now between fans, and this really opened my eyes, that fans were doing so much amazing shit. So I mean, I work on Pokemon too, and I rely upon this Pokemon website that's got all this information up there.
I had a question about Pokemon.
Yeah, so Silent Hill was yeah, man. I mean, if I made mistakes, it's because of that. But I tried. You try to do your internet research. You try to play the game. You try to play the previous game if you got time. But you probably aren't going to have time to just say, all right, let me take 2 weeks and make sure I've digested this whole previous game. You just aren't given that.
I did. So now the way with the Pokemon games, at least, is that they want to have them all out on the same day, and I think it's 7 or 9 languages. I think they just added 2
Oh,
versions, Chinese. So I wanted, just from your professional opinion, how much of a nightmare is that to simulcast?
no, I never translated any Pokemon games.
No, I know. I'm just saying in general for
Yeah.
multiple
Oh,
7 to 9 languages.
fuck.
You know,
It's a what? It's not the fact that they're going to be released at the same time. That's the problem. And in the case of Pokemon, I'd say that it's probably a much better situation than most games because you've got such a deep history of the terminology's already
the
been done
groundwork's
probably.
laid out.
Yeah, yeah. So it's probably not a problem actually.
Not for them.
Yeah, not for Pokemon, you know. But for anything other than that, it would be a huge problem because consistency across the languages. You have to start. You, it's often the case that they'll go from Japanese to English. You know, because you can't easily find a Japanese to whatever other languages translator. But yeah, it's a big headache.
Yeah.
And then the next user question also is concerning the Pokemon animes that you worked on. It says, what's your usual amount of time buffer between translation from Japanese to English when the Pokemon Company International is concerned? Obviously, there could be rewrites, of course, but how complicated is it when they're prepping up for a new generation of Pokemon anime? And, obviously they're tying in games to that.
Well, I can't speak to the relationship with the game production, but the process for the translation is like this. I do the rough. I do a rather direct translation because I'm not in the recording work is done at a studio, and in order to match the lip flap, there need to be adjustments made in the booth. And so as a result of that necessity, I cannot write final text even if I wanted to, because those adjustments have to be made. You have to be looking at the picture and measuring how much time you got and what the actor can get out there to make it look like it's a decent match of the lip flap. So the only way that can be done is for it to be done really finalized at that point. So it works like that. I do a translation, and then it goes over to their side for the final adjustments. So I really don't have that much or any influence over it after that point.
That makes sense. So the next question I have is, you worked on Shenmue for Dreamcast, right?
Not exactly, no. All we did for Shenmue was to coordinate the auditions of the actors, if I recall. And we also, yes. I mean, we brought in the actors
for the just the actors, so not the writing stuff.
Yeah, I mean, they used something like 100 actors or something like this. It was crazy, and we found the main guy through this funny, we did a funny audition in the U.S. for the main roles. But no, we didn't do any of the translation.
What was funny about the audition?
Well, it was funny just even doing that. I mean, the thing was, there was a limited number of voice-over quote-unquote professionals in Japan, and there were so many roles in Shenmue to do. Basically, oh my God, and and after scraping the barrel, I mean, absolutely, absolutely ripping the fucking barrel apart, and on an atomic level, and so they got everybody, and yes, multiple roles, and it was a kind of a nightmare, and they we were told from the top that they wanted the character of Liu to that in the future there was going to be some potential that they would have to make live appearances, and so we decided we had to go out of the country, to find the actor who would fit the bill, and we decided to do a search for I think I don't remember how many roles we. It wasn't just you. It was also whoever the girlie was. So a
That's
few
funny.
roles anyway. Yeah. So we we
Nozomi?
we we put out, oh, pardon me?
Nozomi, the girl?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, yeah. So we put out a call for auditions in New York, and I flew out there, and we auditioned a bunch of people before we decided on who we were going to select, and that's what we did for Shenmue.
Cool. What did you do with Metal Gear Solid? Because you're credited on that as well, and there is a few questions about that. So is that also, were you also involved in the voice acting part, or just the localization?
Yeah, no, I did the localization over 6 months.
Oh wow.
Yeah, 6 months
Those-
in a
yeah,
little tiny
for
room.
Metal Gear, those are dense in trying to get meaning over.
Yeah, that must have been a huge freaking script too.
That was huge. I got these three giant binders from Kojima's team, that had all these original drawings and R&D sketches and stuff like that. And one of them was the script, and one was all these reference materials, and I don't know what the other one was. Um, like details on the weaponry and stuff like that. So I had all that, and yeah, I had 6 months to do it, and I didn't arrange prepayment or partial payment during the thing. So I actually worked for 6 months with zero, and I was
Wow.
broke.
Oh
I
geez.
was I was broke with a couple little babies, and it was really really stressful. But I would say that I poured myself into that job as much as it was certainly the top two or three of in terms of me like putting my soul into it. Maybe number one. I don't know. I mean, I gave it everything,
It
and
turned out really well.
Oh yeah,
I
and
think I think it did turn out really well. And there's some really. I mean, I'm really proud of the work I did on that.
I mean, not only is it a genre-defining game, but it kind of is one of the games that defines PlayStation, I think, as a console, right up
I
there
think
with
so
like Final
too.
Fantasy
I
VII.
think I think it sort of raised the bar for what kind of storytelling you could do, and how it would evolved into such a cinematic series. You know.
Yeah, yeah. And so the thing is, it it's like it's really emblematic of the whole localization thing too, because um, again, there was no expectation that it was ever going to be, put up against the original.
Hmm.
It wasn't
Oh
until
yeah.
Kojima saw it. When Kojima saw it, and he loved the voices and the so much that he decided to put out this version that had them all together.
The international
And
release.
that's when they matched up line to line. And he's like, "Well, wait a second. This is actually it doesn't say this here. It says this, which is slightly different, because they went over it with a fine tooth comb at that point." Um, I think though, in general, I mean, I certainly didn't change anything that I thought was significant. But having said that, the Japanese is so different than if you hear Snake in Japanese, he's like nothing like
No,
how Snake came in English. It's
no.
a different character completely. And David Hayter
He brought
created a
it to life.
character.
Yeah.
Yeah, he created a character along with me. We
Hmm.
created a character together because um, you can't. One thing I've learned from voiceover directing is if you have crappy lines, you can't even do a good voice.
Hmm.
I mean, not really. You
You don't have
can't say
anything to work
things
with.
as if they're believable, you know,
Mm.
as an actor, unless you've got something decent to work with. So, um, yeah, I was involved in the voiceover as well. I was sitting there at the booth, sitting there in front of the soundboard, right next to the director, and I had a microphone, and I could chime in anytime that I wanted and ask actors to do something a little bit differently, and I was encouraged to do that, and I did it quite a lot. So, if you want to call that partial direction or co-direction or semi-direction or dude with a microphone, whatever, but I was, you know,
You were
it's funny. I've heard
influenced, definitely.
I don't know. I think now looking back that maybe they couldn't, maybe the actors misunderstood who I was, or I don't know. But like I've heard some podcasts and things recently where all of them together, and it's like very odd to not see my role discussed when they're discussing like everything else. Um, it's bizarre. Like I'll hear them say stuff like, "Yeah, a Japanese guy told us that we shouldn't do, say this," and there weren't any Japanese guys there, which is the weird thing. What actually, God, I wonder was Hirano there? He didn't speak any English, so he certainly never said anything English. And after a couple of days, this guy Dolph showed up, Scott Dolph, but he never sat at the recording at the soundboard, and he never gave any directions to the. So I don't know what they have sort of strange impressions. Maybe they just thought I was representing. I was getting whispered in the ear from Japan, and everything I said was coming from Japan, which it wasn't.
You were just interpreting. That's what they.
Yeah, I was. I mean, for the most part, I was just trying to get good, good stuff, recorded, and as the way I imagined it, and the director was also trying to do it from her perspective, although she had less, I want to say less full context that I had. And then occasionally at some point, there was a Japanese guy in there who was communicating with Japan, and of course they couldn't really do much because the recording is going by so fast, and he can't possibly catch stuff in time to communicate with Japan and say, okay, what about this? Let alone does he really know much about what the English I wrote says. So there was a few key things I think that they kind of seized upon as really important. Like maybe it was love blooming on a battlefield, and like the guy was ready for that line. Like, okay, in a couple of days we're gonna do the love blooms on a battlefield line. He knows it in Japanese, and he's like all prepped for this because maybe he seized on that as being important, and maybe he wrote to Japan that this was going to come up in a couple of days. So when that did come up, he was ready for that one thing, and he'd say, okay, I have directions from Japan that they're supposed to really smile when they say this line. Happy, happy, happy. So we get to that line, and he was all prepped for it. So he'd say, did they, I want that line to be more happy. And I would say, well, it was pretty happy. Oh, maybe more happy. It'd be like, well, from our perspective, it was as happy as it should be. They were more happy, and so like one out of like 10,000 like lines, we might have gotten that.
So Jeremy, let me ask you, of all the games you've done, what's your favorite one to play?
I would have to say that it would be. It's a little hard for me to separate actually what I love to play and what my kids love to play. At some point, I mean, I had a great experience playing Silent Hill. But then going back to it now, it's like, ooh, I don't really want to even play it because it's like
it doesn't age
so not fun. It's like it's a really not fun experience. It's it's kind of gloomy.
Yeah, I think it. That's kind of what it is, though.
Yeah, it is. So I would say one of my favorite games that I worked on was Shadow Hearts 2. Right.
Yeah.
Ape Escape 2. I mean, how can you not have fun playing that?
Oh
Yeah,
no,
that's a
it's
blast.
a blast.
Dark Cloud 2 is so much fun. Dark Cloud 2 is a great game. I mean,
Real
my
hidden
kids
gem.
played. They must have played 200 hours of Dark Cloud 2.
Yeah, that was a big game when it came out. That was like the one of the PS2's like first big sellers.
It was a really good game. Yeah. So I guess it would be probably those three.
Yeah,
I mean, I love
Ape
Metal Gear
Escape.
Solid too, but I can't go back and play Metal Gear Solid.
How come?
It was a great game.
It's too good,
Um,
too good for a second playthrough, or or is it just it's an investment to sit down and play? It's not like Ape Escape. You just turn it on and have
I
some
don't.
fun.
Yeah, I don't think it's got great replay value.
Well, I'm gonna have to argue with you on there because
Really?
my not me, but my brother, he's played Metal Gear One. Well, saw
Metal Gear Solid.
yeah, Metal Gear Solid One. He's played that through. I want to say I've seen him play it through 9 times. I know he's done it way more.
Wow.
And
Wow.
he for him it's his favorite franchise for
Wow.
Sony. So, um, he goes through them so much, and it's just like I see them vicariously through him. I don't play as
So
much as often.
what does he think about Twin Snakes?
He is preferable to Twin Snakes. I think just because of
No,
the ability
no.
to aim in
Wow.
you know.
Jesus. Okay. So anyway, Metal Gear Solid. I mean, I could talk for forever about Metal Gear Solid. Just that, how it's such a perfect example of really localization in general because
Yeah.
um, and it's just a weird thing because you've got Kojima who when he did Metal Gear Solid he's coming from this perspective of a Japanese guy who's been influenced by Western movies and stuff, right?
Yeah, it's pretty
So
obvious.
imagine a Japanese guy, a Japanese young person who's watching American spy movies and stuff like this, and how cool they seem to him. Okay, he's coming from like cheesy Japanese crime dramas or whatever. So he sees an American movie, and it's incredibly cool. Now, the time lag between what we consider cool and what is cool in Japan is lengthy. I mean,
Blue Jeans,
so
for example.
well, so he could watch something that we would think is really corny as shit and think it's really cool.
Hmm.
There's a time lag involved, and not just the time lag, but also the fact that he's watching something that's translated into Japanese. He's got Japanese subtitles, and he's hearing the English voices. He doesn't really know what they're saying, but they sound cool. But he's reading text that's basically text from a manga. It's the English kind of translated or dumbed down into manga Japanese, and he's reading that, but he's hearing the sounds of these American voices, and it's cool because he can't and at that level, that macro level, he can't tell what's corny or what's a cliche. He can't get sort of subtle references. He receives it in
Ironies.
his own way. Now this guy grows up and he makes a video game primarily for his own audience because that's what he understands. He's not making it with the Western audience in mind. He's making something which also seems cool to a Japanese audience out of the love of these things they grew up with, Western movies, Western. But like I said, there's this time lag between corny and cool that is much slower for Japan. They didn't grow up understanding every nuance of our spy movies or our wars, CNN, and
Mhm.
everything that we grew up with.
So he didn't get to
So
be
when I'm
cheated
asked to
into things.
translate, so I got to translate this thing back into our audience, right? Knowing that we're more sophisticated in terms of our hard edge about politics or our hardness about wars or about spy stuff or about what's corny. We can't watch John Wayne anymore and think it's cool. So in that same way, you as a target audience, some of this shit's going to be really, really uncool. It's going to be so corny and cliched. unless I filter it back through a lens, because now I've got to look at the Kojima thing as a cool thing, even though he's reflecting off, he's riffing off, old American cliches, thinking it's cool. Now I got to look at his thing as the source, bring it back to the original audience. You see, so there's weird lenses going on, and what I tried to do was, and I think I've always been this as a person, I've always had this weird kind of empathic ability. Like I often think I could have been one of these FBI profilers who thinks like the mass murderer, so he can find a. I kind of have a certain knack at that.
Mm-hmm.
So what I tried to do was feel in an empathic sort of way what Kojima was feeling, and what he was creating and recreating and riffing on, and what was coming to him, and then I had tried to reflect that back through my own lens to make that palatable. So that's where I'm at, doing my work, because the way military guys speak, right? Now I have to write text. I have to write text that sounds like a convincing version of how military guys are going to speak to each other. It's not in the Japanese. There's nothing in the Japanese that tells me how to do that, because there's nothing in the Japanese that they don't have a particularly military culture to begin with. So there's a certain looseness to how the Japanese can accept those things that has more rigorous demands in English, because our level of credulity is much higher. Our demands for what can seem authentic is much higher when it comes to many of these things. So I had to do a lot of research and a lot of thinking in order to try to pass what I thought was going to be the hurdle. And I came up with some interesting things that are totally written by me. And when I say totally written, I mean, it's all totally written by me. I was just using the Japanese as the guide for what I had to say, but I wrote it all, and stuff like codec, that now you think it sounds pretty standard, right? Well, I came up with that after thinking and thinking and thinking. What am I going to call this? Because in Japanese it says musenki, which is a wireless. That's the same term that you use for a fucking ham radio, or a fucking, a CB radio or something like that,
And that's not what it was.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a wireless thing. It's this fucking thing he's got in his ear, and he's supposed to be this high-tech spy. And I'm thinking, well, I can't call
it had to have that sexy name.
Yeah, I can't call it a video phone, So I searched and searched and did research on what kind of technologies were out there, and I stumbled upon this, codec, which compression and decompression. And I didn't know anything about it, but I searched and searched and thought. And then there's this, OSP thing, for example, it's just a conversation between Snake and the Colonel, and he's saying, what about weapons, Colonel? What am I going to do? And in Japanese, he says, well, you're going to have to pick them up at the scene. But in Japanese, it's a compound noun, which Genshi Chotatsu, which translates as location acquisition, And as a noun, it sort of sounds like, it sort of has this ring like they've talked about this before. It's a thing, it's a thing that exists in Snake's world. He having to, where you have to get the weapons there, like as if, a military operation would ever be that stupid, Imagine. Don't worry, you'll find something there.
Well, you know what? Give him a few years, and it's going to be the most cost-effective thing.
Yeah, right? So, but I had to make it sound as if it was a thing. And how do you make something sound like a thing? I could have directed the translator and said, get the weapons on the scene. That would have been a direct translation. I held myself to a higher standard, and I thought I've got to make it sound like one military guy talking to another military guy, and they've had this conversation before. So I, thought, and I came up with the idea of on-site procurement, and this didn't exist before.
Right.
I I made it up, and then I called it OSP. OSP. Kernel OSP. But
It's convincing enough.
it's
Yeah, and also, as a game player, not even thinking about the process behind it, because it just makes sense to me when it makes sense. Like sometimes you'll play a game, and you'll go, oh, that must have been a translation glitch, but never with Metal Gear Solid or anything like that.
that was my goal, was to not, was to if I put a single thumbprint on all the writing, and I understand everything, and I research everything until I'm satisfied with how it sounds, and I hear the lines in my head and they sound like they could be performed well, then it'll be a single thumbprint on it, and it won't sound like a translation. And I think that turned out to be the case, but I never did it with the full consideration of the fact that there would be, sort of backseat translators, or people looking over and saying, well, wait a second, actually Solidus was this, or and there's even a couple mistakes in there too. But
Sure, I mean, something that big, there's going to be something.
yeah. So
No one can catch it all.
that's how the localization for that one.
Let me ask you, what was your process on a character like Otto, who is he's a Western character, but he's a big fan of Eastern
Yeah.
culture, and he's written by an actual Eastern person, and then it's put onto you to have to sort of this back and forth of reprocessing. He's a fan of this, but he's this, and then how did you sort of try to not make him a caricature?
I, my first reaction.
That would have been the easy route,
My first reaction is I think I translated Otacon pretty much as it was. I didn't care for him as a character very much,
Mm-hmm.
and I thought that he was overdone uh, in the voice acting department too. I mean, I kind of hate that character, to be honest with you.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah.
Well, he's sort of the
Yeah.
antithesis. The he doesn't have that bravado. He's not the ultra masculine warrior that Snake
Yeah.
is. He's sort of the anti.
I mean, if I had had my druthers, I would have made him a lot more nuanced. Let's put it that way. I mean, I think he's pretty broadly drawn, and the lines he said were I just translated what was there. I think. I mean, it wasn't hard for me to imagine, a character who loved Japanese, anime and stuff like that. It wasn't that was never the case, but yeah, he's got some of the I don't know, more annoying lines for me,
Yeah, I could see that.
Snake, do you really think that love can bloom on a battlefield? I mean, ugh. Okay, next question. Mm. Mm. Well, actually, I just left this startup company I was with, Ikioi. We had started it up. I started it up with an old friend of mine, and after 3 years of trying different stuff, nothing really took root. So, the money dried up, and now I'm back to freelance. Which I think I'm probably happier at.
Any projects coming up that we can look forward to? That you're allowed to talk about?
Yeah, there's to be perfectly honest, there's not much to brag about these days, because the way it's just not the way it used to go. I for example don't have any direct clients anymore, and the reason for that is because for the most part, translation companies or studios, or in some case debugging companies, they grew to become, these giant creatures that also had quote unquote localization departments. Uh, and now the back and forth between, a young person starts at a game company, or they start at a localization company, and they go to the game company in the localization department, or they're in the game company localization department first, and then they go to a translation agency. There's this kind of back and forth now, and when I was doing these things, there weren't translation companies didn't consider games to be anything that they would focus on. There was no word localization, and even the game companies didn't have a localization department until Square set up their own thing for RPGs first. A lot of people looked at that, and and so they cross pollinated. Now, for the most part, these AAA games in particular, they don't go to individual translators, and indeed there's little thought given to who's translating it. It goes to a translation company, and then the translation company finds freelance vendors, for the most part, I'm talking, and that's how it's done. And a lot of the times, the same freelance vendors are working on for different translation companies. So all these resources are shared, but also the time isn't given for one person to do a translation. It's more like, okay, we got, 1 million characters of text, or 2 million characters of text, and we need this done in a 3-month turnaround. And the translation company says, okay, we'll assign it out to a proofreader. And then you've got localization tools, computer-assisted translation tools that store translations in their memory. And so translations get reused. And then, so that the 4 translators don't step on each other's toes and create wildly different style, they have to be very conservative how they translate something. So there's no particularly interesting ways things are written, because if I write a guy speaking as if he's one way, and another translator translates him in a way that conflicts with that, we got a stylistic inconsistency. So in order to avoid that, things are kind of cookie cuttered. Not to mention how the computer-assisted translation tends to even things out by reusing translations. I mean, if I get a translation that says, yameru, I quit. Next time yameru comes up in the text, it's going to offer me that as a already done translation. So am I going to say, screw it, I'm out of here? Or am I going to just say, oh, okay, they want I quit, and can't mess with consistency, so we'll just leave it as I quit. So every character says I quit. This is just an example. Yeah, it's just like
you're losing that context.
Yeah, so now it's less of a creative process as you're writing it, as is a straight translation.
Yeah, it's very much. And so there's nothing really I can brag and say, hey, yeah, I've got this, great thing coming out. The last thing I did that I was able to touch in its entirety was this translation of Kamaitachi no Yoru, the Night of the Sickle Weasels in Japanese. We retitled it the last Banshee's Last Cry. It only came out on the iOS mobile phone game. I translated that in its entirety, and I was able to write it with complete freedom. And best thing I would say I'd want anyone to look at of my own work. Other things, I've touched this mobile game here and there, but it's not to say that I would, brag about the localization. And there isn't anything really going on that's, interesting from that perspective to me.
We're also at about 2 hours, so I think we can call it there. I'm sure there's so much more we could talk about Konami and Metal Gear Solid and all of that. But Jeremy, dude, you've been freaking awesome.
Oh yeah, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, man, and thank you personally for bringing Snatcher to me. That was a nice thing.
My pleasure.
Yeah,
This-
no, I've had hours, hours, and hours, countless of entertainment, probably thanks to you.
Snatcher. I
Yeah.
mean, I love Snatcher as much as you do. Oh yeah. I mean, actually, I should have totally answered that question. Snatcher. That question you asked about what my favorite
Your
game.
favorite one?
There's no question in my mind that my favorite is probably Snatcher. I mean, it's not that I play it, but Snatcher, never leaves your mind, in a way.
No, you're right. I mean, to me, it really changed the way I looked at when I first played it. It was probably 99 or 2000 or something. So years after it
That's
came
pretty
out,
early.
but it really
Yeah.
changed the way to me I felt like a game could connect emotionally and tell like a big story. Like Metal Gear Solid tells a story, but Snatcher is like immersive into a world, you know. So it changed that perspective for me from that point
Yeah,
on in my life.
I can't entirely explain it either. Why it has that for me as well. I've had people say, it saved my life. I was going to commit suicide if it weren't for
Wow.
Snatcher, or Silent Hill, or different things.
Yeah.
But
Or Animaniacs. It's a good game, man.
yeah,
It's funny.
Animaniacs.
It's funny. I enjoy it.
Really? Yeah,
You know, when you
Animaniacs.
grow up with something, it stays with you,
Yeah,
even if it's
yeah.
something silly like Animaniacs. You know.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad to hear that. I mean, like I said, that was the first. I mean, I think that was probably the first game text that I ever was asked to write creatively, and there wasn't that much room for a lot. Um,
No,
but
I don't
all
think
that text was written after the stages. Actually, they said, what stages should we, come up with some ideas for stages. Basically, we'll set it on a movie
on the lot,
movie lot.
so you could
Proactively
do
think,
pretty
what are we
much
going to call
anything,
this stage, and
like genres.
um, oh yeah, no, it was all
It's
that funny
getting
like Raiders of the Lost Ark stuff that I put in there, and yeah, so some funny puns in there, I think.
Yeah.
Funny joke.
Well, I appreciate you talking to us and listening to my diatribe of the human spirit and
Awesome, awesome. Well,
Oh
anytime,
yeah.
guys. I had a real pleasure speaking with you all, and if you have
Oh yeah.
any follow-ups or anything you wanna retouch on later, I'm open to that too. So podcasts are fun.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, this was a blast, man. Thanks again.
Oh yeah.
I love
Okay,
how direct and unfiltered you were. In fact, I
cool.
think that's going to be the title of it to me, Jerry Blaustein Unfiltered.
I think that's good.